The gunshot that killed Georgia Morrison's husband echoed through the canyon for 3 seconds before silence swallowed everything whole. She was 24 years old, standing in the doorway of their small ranch house outside Marysville, Utah, watching the sheriff's wagon carry Thomas's body away down the dirt road that spring morning in 1882. The apple blossoms were just beginning to open on the trees Thomas had planted 2 years earlier, and Georgia made herself a promise as white petals drifted past her face. She would never love another man. She would never put herself through this particular brand of hell again. She would raise their daughter Emma alone, work the land alone, and die alone when her time came. Love was a luxury she could no longer afford, not when the cost was this devastating. The ranch hands who had worked for Thomas tried to stay on for a few weeks, but Georgia's grief made her harsh and distant. She paid them what she owed and sent them away one by one, until only she and 3-year-old Emma remained in the house that suddenly felt enormous and suffocating all at once. The cattle still needed tending, the horses still needed feeding, and the land still demanded its due regardless of whether her heart was beating or just going through the motions. 6 months passed like that. Georgia learned to rope and brand, learned to mend fences and break ice on the water troughs when winter came early that year. Her hands grew calloused and her back grew strong, and she spoke only when absolutely necessary. Emma was a quiet child who seemed to understand that her mother was holding herself together with nothing but willpower and routine. The townspeople of Marysville tried to help at first, bringing casseroles and offers of assistance, but Georgia's cold politeness eventually convinced them to leave her be. It was a bitter January morning when Carter Evans first rode onto her property. Georgia was wrestling with a section of fence that had come down in the night, her breath forming clouds in the freezing air, when she heard hoofbeats approaching. She straightened up and put her hand on the rifle she now carried everywhere, watching as a tall man on a paint horse made his way carefully through the snow toward her. He stopped a respectful distance away and touched the brim of his hat. "Morning, madam. I'm Carter Evans. I worked for the Henderson Ranch over in Sevier County until last month. Heard you might need help with your operation here." Georgia looked him over with the same critical eye she used for evaluating livestock. He was maybe 27 or 28, with dark hair that needed cutting and steady gray eyes that met hers without flinching. His clothes were worn but clean, and his horse was well cared for. "None of that mattered. You heard wrong," she said flatly. "I manage fine on my own." Carter glanced at the sagging fence, at the barn door hanging crooked on its hinges, at the corral where 2 horses stood in conditions that were adequate but far from ideal. He did not point out any of these things. Instead, he just nodded. "I can see that, madam. Thing is, I need work and you've got work that needs doing. I'm not asking for much, just fair wages and a place in the bunkhouse. I know my way around cattle and horses and I'm good with repairs." I said no. Georgia turned back to the fence, dismissing him. She heard him sit there for another moment, heard his horse shift its weight. Then he said quietly, "Your fence posts are rotting at the base. That is why this section keeps coming down. You can patch it all you want, but come spring thaw it will fall again. I could replace them properly." Georgia spun around, anger flashing hot in her chest because he was right and she knew it, and she hated that he had seen what she had been trying to ignore. "I do not need some drifter telling me what is wrong with my property. I do not need help. I do not need company. I need you to ride back the way you came and leave me in peace." Carter absorbed this without apparent offense. "All right, madam, I understand. But if you change your mind, I will be staying at the boarding house in town for a while. Name's Carter Evans." He touched his hat again and turned his horse, and Georgia watched him ride away with something uncomfortable twisting in her stomach that might have been regret or might have been relief. 2 weeks later, a winter storm rolled down from the mountains with a fury that seemed personal. Georgia got Emma secured in the house and then fought her way to the barn to make sure the animals were safe. The wind was so strong it knocked her sideways twice, and the snow came down so thick she could barely see her own hands in front of her face. She got the barn door closed and latched, got the horses calmed down, and was checking on the 3 milk cows in their stalls when she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. The cattle. The small herd that represented most of her savings and all of her future was out in the far pasture, and in a storm like this, they would drift with the wind until they either found shelter or died trying. Georgia knew she should stay in the barn, wait out the storm, accept the loss. That was the smart thing to do. But desperation makes people stupid, and she had too much of herself invested in those cattle to let them go without a fight. She pulled her scarf up over her face, lowered her head against the wind, and pushed out into the storm. She made it maybe 30 yards before she realized she had made a terrible mistake. She could not see the house anymore, could not see the barn, could not see anything but white. The wind was stealing the breath from her lungs, and the cold was already seeping through her coat. She turned around, trying to retrace her steps, but her footprints were already gone. Panic set in then, real and primal. She thought of Emma in the house, thought of her daughter waking up to find her mother frozen in a snowdrift, thought of the promise she had made to Thomas to take care of their child. She stumbled forward, then sideways, then did not know which direction was which anymore. That was when she heard the voice. Georgia, Mrs. Morrison, someone was calling her name, and then there were hands on her arms, a solid shape materializing out of the white chaos. Carter Evans pulled her against his side and turned them both, and somehow he seemed to know which direction to go. He half carried, half dragged her through the storm, and after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the barn loomed up in front of them. He got her inside and latched the door shut, then stood there breathing hard while snow melted in rivulets down his face. "What in God's name were you thinking?" he asked, and there was anger in his voice but also something that sounded like fear. "You could have died out there." Georgia was shaking so hard she could barely stand. "The cattle," she managed through chattering teeth. "They are in the far pasture." "The cattle are alive and probably sheltering in the canyon where they have sense enough to go when the weather turns," Carter said. He pulled off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders over her own. "You, on the other hand, almost became a very foolish corpse. What are you doing here?" The question came out more accusing than grateful, but Georgia was too cold and scared to soften it. Carter steered her to a hay bale and pushed her down onto it. "I was in town when the storm hit, saw how bad it was getting and thought about you out here with just your little girl. Figured I would check to make sure you were all right." He found a horse blanket and draped it over her legs. "Good thing I did." They stayed in the barn for 2 hours while the storm raged outside. Carter kept checking on the animals, keeping them calm while Georgia gradually stopped shaking. He did not lecture her or press her for conversation. He just worked, steady and quiet, occasionally glancing over to make sure she was still breathing. When the storm finally broke and the wind died down to something manageable, Carter walked her back to the house. Emma met them at the door, her eyes huge with worry, and Georgia swept her daughter up into her arms and held on tight. Carter stood in the doorway, snow-covered and exhausted. "I will check the property lines tomorrow, make sure your herd is accounted for," he said. "You do not have to do that," Georgia said, but the protest was weak. "I know I do not have to." Carter met her eyes. "I will come by around midday." Then he was gone, trudging back through the snow toward wherever he had left his horse. Georgia put Emma to bed that night with an extra story and an extra kiss, then sat by the fire and stared into the flames for a long time. She had sworn she would never need anyone again, never depend on anyone, never let anyone close enough to hurt her. But she could not deny that Carter Evans had saved her life today, and she could not quite figure out why that made her feel angry instead of grateful. He came back the next day as promised, riding up at noon with his paint horse breaking trail through the deep snow. Georgia was ready for him this time, had coffee brewing and words prepared. She met him at the porch before he could dismount. "I want to thank you for yesterday," she said stiffly. "I was foolish and you helped me. I appreciate it." Carter swung down from his horse. "You are welcome." "But I still do not need a ranch hand," Georgia continued. "I can manage." Carter looked at her for a long moment, and there was something in his expression that was both amused and sad. "Mrs. Morrison, with all due respect, you are managing. Barely. You are working yourself into the ground trying to do the job of 3 men, and eventually something is going to give. That something might be your health, might be your land, might be your daughter's well-being when you are too exhausted to take care of her properly." The words hit harder because they were true. Georgia felt her jaw tighten. "How I run my ranch is my business." "It is," Carter agreed, "and how I spend my time is mine, so I will make you a deal. Let me work for you for 1 month. If at the end of that month you are not satisfied, I will leave and never bother you again. But if things are running smoother, if you have a little more time to spend with your daughter, if the weight on your shoulders feels a little lighter, then we talk about something more permanent." "I cannot afford to pay you much," Georgia said, hating that she was weakening. "I do not need much." Carter's voice was quiet, reasonable. "Just a fair wage in the bunkhouse. That is all I am asking, Mrs. Morrison, a chance to work and a place to sleep while I do it." Georgia wanted to say no. Every instinct she had developed over the past 6 months screamed at her to send him away, to protect herself, to stay closed off and safe. But she thought about Emma, thought about the long days when she barely had time to speak to her daughter, thought about how close she had come to dying yesterday and leaving her child all alone in the world. "1 month," she said finally, "and you keep to the bunkhouse. You do your work and I do mine, and we do not need to be friends or anything else." Something flickered across Carter's face, too quick to identify. "That suits me fine, madam." He moved into the bunkhouse that afternoon, carrying in a bedroll and a single bag that seemed to contain everything he owned. Georgia watched from the kitchen window, Emma sitting at the table behind her working on learning her letters. When Carter emerged from the bunkhouse and headed straight to the barn to start working, something in Georgia's chest felt tight and uncomfortable. The next few weeks fell into a pattern. Carter rose before dawn and worked until well after dark, fixing everything that Georgia had been putting off or doing poorly. He replaced the fence posts like he had promised, repaired the barn door, reinforced the corral, and took over the heavy work of feeding and watering the livestock. He found the herd safe in the canyon exactly where he had said they would be, and he moved them to a pasture closer to the barn where they could be monitored more easily. He was good at his job. Georgia had to admit that. He worked hard and he worked smart, and he had a way with the horses that bordered on uncanny. Within a week, the ranch was running more smoothly than it had in months. Within 2 weeks, Georgia found herself with time to actually sit down for meals with Emma, to read to her daughter at bedtime, to do the mending by lamplight instead of falling into bed too exhausted to think. But Carter kept his distance like she had asked. He was polite when they crossed paths, respectful, quiet. He did not push for conversation or try to join them for meals. He did his work and kept to the bunkhouse, and Georgia told herself that was exactly what she wanted. Emma, however, had other ideas. The little girl was fascinated by the cowboy who had appeared on their property. She would stand at the window and watch him work, or slip out to the barn when she thought her mother was not paying attention. Georgia scolded her the first few times, but Carter was always gentle with Emma, answering her endless questions with patience and even teaching her how to brush the horses properly. One evening near the end of the month, Georgia went out to call Emma in for supper and found her daughter sitting on the fence rail watching Carter work with a young colt in the corral. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting everything gold and pink, and Emma was laughing at something Carter had said. The sound of her daughter's laughter stopped Georgia in her tracks. She could not remember the last time she had heard Emma laugh like that, free and light and childish. The weight of guilt settled on her shoulders. She had been so focused on surviving, on keeping the ranch going, on protecting her own shattered heart, that she had not noticed how much Emma needed someone to pay attention to her, to play with her, to make her smile. Carter looked up and saw Georgia standing there. Something in her expression must have given her away because his own face softened. "She is a good kid," he said quietly, "smart as a whip." "She likes you," Georgia said, and the words felt like an accusation. "I like her too." Carter lifted Emma down from the fence. "Go on inside, little bit. Your mama needs to talk to me." Emma ran to the house, still giggling, and Georgia found herself alone with Carter in the fading light. The month was almost up. She needed to make a decision. "The month ends tomorrow," she said. "I know." Carter leaned against the fence, relaxed but watchful. "So what do you think, Mrs. Morrison? Has it been useful having me around, or would you rather I pack up and go?" Georgia crossed her arms over her chest. "You have been helpful," she admitted grudgingly. "The place is running better." "I will give you that. But I do not know if I want you to stay." The honesty surprised her, but once it started coming out, she could not stop it. "I do not know if I want anyone to stay. I do not know if I can do this, have someone else here, depend on someone again." Carter was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was careful. "I know you lost your husband. I do not know the details, and I am not asking. But I can see that it hurt you bad enough that you built walls tall enough to keep everyone out. That is your right, Mrs. Morrison. Nobody gets to tell you how to grieve or when to move on or what you should feel." Georgia felt her throat tighten. "Then what are you doing here?" "Working," Carter said simply. "Just working. I am not trying to replace anybody or push my way into your life or make you feel anything you do not want to feel. I just need a job, and you need help, and that is all this has to be for as long as you want it to be. And if that is all it ever is?" Georgia asked, and she did not know why that question hurt to voice. Carter looked at her with those steady gray eyes. "Then that is all it will be. I am not going anywhere, Mrs. Morrison, not unless you tell me to. And if you are not ready for anything more than an employer and an employee, that is fine. I will be here when you are ready, if you are ever ready. And if you are not, I will be here anyway, doing my job, keeping my distance, and making sure you and your daughter are safe." Something cracked in Georgia's chest, some piece of the armor she had been wearing so tightly. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do that?" Carter was quiet for so long that Georgia thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Because some things are worth waiting for. And some people are worth being patient with." He pushed off the fence and picked up his hat. "Think about it tonight. Let me know in the morning what you decide." Then he walked back to the bunkhouse, leaving Georgia standing alone in the twilight with tears on her face that she had not felt fall. She did not sleep much that night. She lay in bed and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling, the horses nickering softly in the barn, the wind moving through the bare trees. She thought about Thomas, about the life they had planned together and the future that had been stolen from them. She thought about Emma, about her daughter's laughter earlier, about how much the little girl needed stability and consistency, and maybe even a male figure in her life who would not disappear. She thought about Carter, about his patience and his steadiness, and the way he had never once pushed her for more than she was willing to give. About the way he had said he would be here when she was ready, if she was ever ready, and if not, he would be here anyway. The next morning she found him in the barn already working. He looked up when she came in, his expression neutral, waiting. "You can stay," Georgia said. "Not just for another month, for as long as it works out." Carter nodded slowly. "All right, thank you, Mrs. Morrison." "Georgia," she said and surprised herself. "You can call me Georgia." Something lit up in Carter's eyes, quick and bright. "Georgia," he repeated like he was testing the weight of it. "Thank you, Georgia." She turned to leave, then paused. "And Carter, thank you for being patient." "Like I said." His voice was soft. "Some things are worth waiting for." Spring came to Marysvale with a rush of meltwater and new grass. The ranch woke up from winter, and with Carter's help, Georgia expanded the operation slightly. They bought 3 more head of cattle, repaired the irrigation ditches, and planted a garden that was twice the size of what Georgia had managed the year before. Emma bloomed along with the land. She followed Carter everywhere when Georgia would let her, learning to rope fence posts and identify different plants and birds. Carter taught her to ride on the gentlest of the horses, and Georgia watched from the porch with her heart in her throat as her daughter trotted around the corral, grinning like the sun itself. Carter kept his word about keeping his distance. He worked, he was polite, he joined them for meals now, but always left as soon as the dishes were cleared. He never touched Georgia except by accident, never said anything that could be construed as romantic or forward. He was just there, steady and reliable, day after day. It should have been enough. Georgia told herself it was enough. But somewhere in those long spring days she started to notice things. The way Carter's hands looked when he was working with leather, strong and sure and capable. The sound of his laugh when Emma said something funny. The way he always checked to make sure Georgia had enough firewood before he went to the bunkhouse each night. She started to notice that when he smiled at her, really smiled, her stomach did something strange and fluttery. She started to notice that she looked forward to breakfast because it meant sitting across from him with morning coffee, talking about the day's work in the comfortable quiet they had developed. She started to notice that the bunkhouse seemed very far away from the main house, and sometimes at night she wondered what he was thinking, if he was lying awake the way she was, if he ever regretted his promise to wait. It terrified her. This slow, creeping warmth that was working its way past her defenses despite all her best efforts. She had sworn she would never love again, and here her treacherous heart was whispering that maybe it was not love yet, but it could be, if she let it, if she was brave enough to try. Summer came hot and dry. They moved the cattle to higher pastures where the grass was still green, and Carter spent long days on horseback checking the herd. Georgia hired 2 temporary hands for the season, young men from town who needed work, and the ranch felt almost bustling with activity. One of the young men, a boy named Jack who was maybe 19, developed an obvious crush on Georgia. He found excuses to work near the house, tried to impress her with his roping skills, and generally made a nuisance of himself in that harmless, puppy-like way of young men who have not yet learned subtlety. Georgia was oblivious, but Carter was not. She noticed him watching Jack with an expression that might have been amusement or might have been something less pleasant. She noticed that Carter started assigning Jack to the farthest, least pleasant jobs on the ranch. She noticed the tension in Carter's shoulders when Jack laughed too loud at something Georgia said. It took her an embarrassingly long time to realize that Carter was jealous. The realization hit her one evening when they were all at supper. Jack was telling some elaborate story about a horse he had broken once, clearly exaggerating for effect, and Georgia was only half listening while she cut up meat for Emma. Jack made some joke and Georgia smiled politely, and when she looked up, Carter was staring at his plate with his jaw so tight she could see the muscle jumping. After supper, she followed him out to the barn where he was checking on a mare that was due to foal soon. "Carter," she said quietly. He did not turn around. "Mare's looking good, should be any day now." "Carter," she said again. "Look at me." He turned and the expression on his face was carefully neutral. "Something you need, Georgia." "I need you to tell me what is wrong," she said. "You have been strange all week." "Nothing is wrong," but his voice was too flat, too controlled. Georgia took a step closer. "Is it Jack, the way he has been acting?" Carter's eyes flashed. "Jack can act however he wants. It is none of my business." "But it bothers you," Georgia said, and it was not a question. "No." Carter turned back to the horse. "You are free to encourage whoever you want. Like I said, none of my business." "I am not encouraging him," Georgia protested. "He is a child. I barely notice him." "Could have fooled me," Carter muttered. "Are you jealous?" The question came out sharper than Georgia intended, but suddenly she needed to know. Needed to hear him say it, needed to understand what was happening between them. Carter froze. For a long moment he did not move, did not speak. Then he said very quietly, "Yes, I am jealous. I am jealous every time some man looks at you and thinks he might have a chance. I am jealous when you smile at other people the way you never quite smile at me. I am jealous of every moment you spend thinking about anything or anyone else." He turned to face her, and his eyes were blazing now. "I know I have no right. I know I said I would wait, that I would not push, that I would be patient. And I mean that. I will keep that promise if it kills me. But you asked what was wrong, and that is what is wrong, Georgia. I am standing here watching you live your life and wondering if there will ever be room in it for me, and it is eating me alive." Georgia could not breathe. The words hung between them like something physical, something that could not be taken back or ignored. "Carter," she whispered, "I am sorry." He scrubbed a hand over his face. "I should not have said that. That is not fair to you. You have made your boundaries clear and I respect them. I will keep respecting them. What if I do not want you to?" The question was so soft that for a moment Georgia was not sure she had actually said it out loud. But Carter's head snapped up, his eyes searching her face. "What?" Georgia took a shaky breath. "What if I do not want boundaries anymore? What if I am tired of being alone? What if I think about you at night and wonder what it would be like if you were closer? What if I am terrified and confused and I do not know how to do this again, but I think maybe I want to try?" Carter crossed the distance between them in 2 strides. He stopped just short of touching her, his hands hovering near her arms like he was afraid she would bolt. "Georgia, are you sure? Because if you are not absolutely sure, we should not do this. I meant what I said. I will wait as long as you need." "I am not sure," Georgia admitted. "I am not sure of anything except that I am tired of being scared, and I think you might be worth the risk of being scared." Carter's hands finally settled on her shoulders, warm and solid. "I will not hurt you," he said fiercely. "I swear to you, Georgia, I will never hurt you the way you have been hurt before." "You cannot promise that," Georgia said. "Something could happen to you. You could get sick or injured or killed like Thomas was. I could lose you too." "You could," Carter agreed. "Life does not come with guarantees, but I can promise that I will do everything in my power to stay alive and stay with you. I can promise that I will be careful and smart, and I will not take stupid risks. I can promise that every day I have with you, I will make it count." Georgia looked up at him, at this man who had appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer she had been too afraid to voice. "I do not know how to do this," she whispered. "I do not know how to open up again." "Then we will figure it out together," Carter said. Slow as you need. Careful as you want. I am not going anywhere, Georgia. I told you that from the start. He kissed her then, gentle and careful, like she was something precious that might break. Georgia felt something inside her chest that had been frozen for 2 years finally begin to thaw. She kissed him back, tentative at first and then stronger, her hands coming up to grip his shirt. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Carter rested his forehead against hers. I have been wanting to do that since the day I met you, he admitted. Really? Georgia felt herself smile, an actual real smile that reached all the way to her eyes. Even when I was being horrible to you, especially then, Carter said and laughed. You were so fierce and stubborn and strong. How could I not fall for you? They stood there in the barn for a long time, just holding each other while the horses moved quietly in their stalls and the evening light faded outside. When they finally walked back to the house together, Carter's arm around George's shoulders, Emma looked up from her drawing and grinned like she had known all along this was coming. The next few months were strange and wonderful and terrifying all at once. Georgia and Carter moved carefully around each other, learning how to be together, learning how to trust. Carter moved his things from the bunkhouse to the main house, taking over the small room that had once been Thomas's study. It felt significant, like a step toward something permanent, but he was careful not to push for more than Georgia was ready to give. They worked the ranch together, side by side now, and Georgia discovered that sharing the burden made everything lighter. They made decisions together, planned together, built something together that felt like it belonged to both of them. Carter was patient when Georgia had bad days, when grief would hit her out of nowhere and she would withdraw into herself. He never took it personally, never demanded more than she could give. Emma adored Carter, and the feeling was clearly mutual. He taught her to ride better, taught her to throw a rope, told her stories about his own childhood growing up on a ranch in Colorado. He was gentle with her, but he also treated her like a person with her own thoughts and opinions, and Emma responded by following him around like a devoted shadow. One night in early fall, after Emma was asleep, Georgia and Carter sat on the porch watching the stars come out. Georgia was tucked under Carter's arm, her head on his shoulder, feeling more at peace than she had in years. "Can I ask you something?" she said quietly. "Anything. Why did you really come here that first day? The truth." Carter was quiet for a moment. "I heard about you in town," he said finally. "Heard about the widow trying to run a ranch by herself, about how she refused all help and was working herself into an early grave. And I thought about my own mother." Georgia looked up at him. "Your mother? She was widowed young too," Carter said. "My father died when I was 10. She tried to run our ranch alone, tried to do everything herself. She was so determined to prove she did not need help from anyone. She worked herself to death, literally. She was gone before I turned 15. His voice was rough with old pain. "I could not help my mother. She would not let anyone help her. But when I heard about you, I thought maybe I could help you instead. Maybe I could keep another stubborn widow from killing herself with pride." Georgia felt tears prick her eyes. "Carter, I am so sorry." "It was a long time ago," Carter said, "but it is why I came here. And it is why I stayed even when you made it clear you did not want me around. I could see you heading down the same path my mother did, and I could not just walk away." "I am glad you did not," Georgia whispered. She turned in his arms and kissed him, putting into the kiss everything she could not yet say out loud. All the gratitude and the growing love and the terrifying hope that maybe, just maybe, this could work. Fall turned to winter, and the ranch prepared for the cold months ahead. The temporary hands were paid off and sent home, leaving just Georgia, Carter, and Emma to manage through the snow and ice. It should have been isolating, but instead it felt cozy, like the three of them were a unit that did not need anyone else. Carter proposed on Christmas Eve. They were sitting by the fire after putting Emma to bed, and he pulled out a simple gold band that had belonged to his mother. "I know it has only been a year," he said, "and I know you swore you would never remarry. But Georgia, I love you. I love Emma. I love the life we are building here. And I want to make it official if you will have me." Georgia looked at the ring, then at Carter's face, and felt her carefully constructed walls finally crumble completely. "I love you too," she said, and watched his face light up like sunrise. "I did not think I could. I did not think I would ever let myself. But I do, Carter. I love you so much it scares me." "Is that a yes?" Carter asked, grinning. "Yes," Georgia said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, I will marry you." They were married in early spring of 1884, a small ceremony in the church in Marysville with just a handful of friends and neighbors in attendance. Emma was the flower girl, beaming with pride in her new dress. Georgia wore a simple blue gown and held wildflowers, and when Carter slipped the ring onto her finger, she felt something settle in her chest that felt like coming home. The ranch prospered over the next few years. With two people running it full time, they were able to expand gradually, adding more cattle, buying the neighboring property when it came up for sale, building a bigger barn. Emma grew tall and strong, learning ranching skills from both her mother and the man she started calling Pa, without anyone having to ask her to. Georgia discovered that loving again did not diminish what she had felt for Thomas. She could hold both loves in her heart at the same time, could honor the memory of her first husband while building a life with her second. Carter never tried to replace Thomas or make Georgia forget him. He understood that she had loved before, and that the capacity to love again did not erase that history. In the summer of 1885, Georgia realized she was pregnant. The news terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. She had not thought about having more children, had not imagined that her life might hold that particular joy again. But when she told Carter, he picked her up and spun her around, laughing with pure delight. "Are you happy?" she asked, her hands on his shoulders, searching his face. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Carter said. "Georgia, you have given me everything. A home, a family, a purpose, and now another child to love. I am the luckiest man alive." The pregnancy was easier than her first had been, maybe because she was not doing all the heavy work herself this time. Carter took over the hardest tasks and hired extra help, determined that Georgia would not overdo it. Emma was excited about becoming a big sister and spent hours talking to Georgia's growing belly, telling the baby about the ranch and the horses and everything they would do together. Their son was born in late winter, a healthy baby boy with dark hair and his father's gray eyes. They named him Thomas Carter Evans, honoring both the past and the present. Georgia held him in her arms that first night and marveled at how full her heart felt, how it was possible to feel this much love without breaking apart from the weight of it. Carter sat beside the bed, one arm around Georgia, the other hand gently touching the baby's soft head. Emma was curled up next to them, already half asleep, completely enchanted with her new brother. "Look at us," Carter said softly. "Look at this family we made." Georgia leaned her head against his shoulder. "I never thought I could have this again," she admitted. "After Thomas died, I was so certain that part of my life was over." "I am glad you were wrong," Carter said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I am glad you let me prove you wrong." "So am I," Georgia said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. The years that followed were not perfect. They had hard winters and drought summers. They lost cattle to disease and once nearly lost the ranch to a brush fire that swept through the valley. There were arguments and disagreements and days when they were both too tired and stressed to be patient with each other. But they worked through it all together. Carter kept his promise to be careful and stay alive, and Georgia kept her promise to keep her heart open even when it was scary. They built a life that was rich and full and good, surrounded by the land they loved and the family they had created. Emma grew up to be a skilled rancher in her own right. She married a young man from town when she was 22, a kind fellow who loved her fierce independence and had no problem with the idea of marrying into a ranching family. They built a house on the far edge of the property and started their own herd, expanding the family operation even further. Thomas Carter, who everyone called Tommy, grew into a sturdy boy who loved horses more than anything else in the world. He had his father's patience and his mother's determination, and by the time he was 10, he could outride most of the grown men in the county. In 1888, Georgia found herself pregnant again, much to everyone's surprise, including her own. Their daughter was born that fall, a tiny thing with red hair that came from neither parent and a temperament that was pure sunshine. They named her Hope, because that was what she represented. Hope for the future, hope that good things could keep happening, hope that the love they had built was strong enough to keep growing. Carter aged gracefully, going gray at the temples but staying strong and active well into his 50s. Georgia's hair silvered too, and her hands became weathered from decades of ranch work, but she had never been happier. She had built 2 lives in her time on the ranch outside Marysville, and while the first had ended in tragedy, the second had become more than she ever dreamed possible. They made a tradition of sitting on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the mountains. Sometimes the whole family would gather, 3 generations now with Emma's children running around the yard. Sometimes it was just Georgia and Carter, holding hands in the comfortable silence of 2 people who knew each other down to their bones. One such evening, when they were both in their 60s and the ranch was thriving under the combined management of their children, Georgia turned to Carter and said, "Do you ever regret it? Being so patient with me? Waiting all those months before I was ready?" Carter looked at her with those same steady gray eyes that had first drawn her in. "Not for one single second," he said. "You were worth every moment of waiting. You were worth everything, Georgia." "I used to think I could never love again," Georgia said. "I was so sure that loving someone meant setting yourself up to be destroyed when you lost them. I was so determined to protect myself that I nearly missed out on all of this." "But you did not miss it," Carter pointed out. "You were scared, but you were brave anyway. That is all anyone can do." Georgia leaned her head on his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence beside her. "I am glad you came to my ranch that day," she said. "I am glad you stayed even when I tried to push you away. I am glad you loved me enough to be patient." "I will always love you enough to be patient," Carter said. "Though I am happy to report that I do not have to be patient anymore. I get to just love you every day for the rest of our lives." They sat there as the stars came out, as the sounds of their family drifted from the house behind them, as the ranch settled into nighttime quiet. Georgia thought about the woman she had been 15 years ago, so broken and determined never to heal. She thought about the promise she had made to never remarry, never love again, never put herself at risk of that kind of pain. And she was grateful, so deeply grateful, that life had sent her a patient cowboy who was willing to wait, who saw past her walls to the woman underneath, who proved to her that love was not about avoiding pain but about finding someone worth hurting for, someone worth taking the risk for, someone worth building a life with no matter how scary it might be. "Thank you," she whispered to Carter. "For what? For waiting. For staying. For loving me." Carter squeezed her hand. "Thank you for being ready," he said, "for letting me in, for loving me back." They sat there until the night grew cold and they had to go inside where the fire was burning warm. But even as they went through the familiar routine of closing up the house and preparing for bed, even as they climbed the stairs to the room they had shared for over a decade, Georgia felt the truth of it settle deep in her bones. Love was always a risk. Opening your heart always meant inviting the possibility of pain. But it also meant inviting joy and partnership, and the kind of deep contentment that could only come from sharing your life with someone who truly knew you. Thomas would always hold a place in her heart, would always be Emma's father, would always be part of her story. But Carter was her present and her future, the man who had seen her at her most broken and loved her anyway. The man who had promised to wait, and then had kept that promise with a patience that still took her breath away. As she drifted off to sleep that night, Carter's arm around her waist and his breath warm on her neck, Georgia Morrison Evans sent up a prayer of gratitude for second chances, for patient cowboys, for the courage to love again even when it terrified her, for the life she had built from the ashes of grief and loss. She had sworn she would never remarry, would never love again, and she had been so wrong, so blessedly, wonderfully wrong. And she had never been happier to break a promise in her entire life. The ranch outside Marysvale continued to thrive for generations. Emma's children inherited their grandparents' love of the land and their work ethic. Tommy became one of the most respected horse trainers in Utah. Hope grew up to be a teacher, but she never left the ranch, building a schoolhouse on the property so local children could get an education without traveling to town. Georgia and Carter lived long, full lives. They saw their grandchildren grow and have children of their own. They celebrated 50 years of marriage surrounded by dozens of family members, all of them proof of the life they had built together from nothing but patience and love. When Georgia finally passed away at the age of 83, Carter held her hand and whispered the same words he had said to her all those years ago. "You were worth waiting for. You were worth everything." And when Carter followed her 2 years later, slipping away peacefully in his sleep in the house they had shared for half a century, the entire town of Marysvale turned out for his funeral. They spoke of his patience, his kindness, his unwavering devotion to the widow who had sworn never to remarry. They spoke of the love story that had started with a man willing to wait and a woman brave enough to eventually let him in. They spoke of the family that had been built from that love, the legacy that would continue for generations. And on the headstone they placed beside George's, beneath Carter's name and the dates of his long life, they carved the words that defined him best. He waited, and it was worth it. The ranch still stands today, passed down through the family, a testament to two people who found each other in the hardest of times, who proved that love could grow even in the frozen soil of grief, who showed that patience was not passive, but an active choice to believe in someone even when they did not believe in themselves. Georgia Morrison Evans had sworn she would never remarry, would never love again. But a patient cowboy named Carter Evans had seen past her walls and her fear. He had promised to wait until she was ready, and he had kept that promise without complaint or expectation. And in the end, love had won. Not because it was easy, but because they both chose it day after day, year after year. They chose each other, chose the risk, chose the vulnerability and the possibility of pain, because the alternative was never knowing the depth of joy that comes from truly opening your heart to another person. Their story became legend in Marysvale, passed down from grandparents to grandchildren. The widow and the cowboy, the woman who said never and the man who said he would wait. The love that almost did not happen but became the foundation for a legacy that would last forever. And every time someone told the story, they ended it the same way. With the words that Carter had spoken in the barn that summer evening when everything changed. The words that became his promise, his vow, his absolute truth. "I will be here when you are ready," he had been. And she had been brave enough to finally let him stay, and that made all the difference.